Welcome to Debating Russia, Voice of Russia's new political debate program. I'm Peter Lavelle. The pivot to Asia. We hear this phrase a lot these days. The Asia-Pacific Rim is indeed turning into an important area of geopolitical interest for many countries, including Russia, the United States, and of course, China. As this region grows in importance, what are the chances for peaceful cooperation, and what are the risks of confrontation? To discuss this important issue, I'm joined by my guests in London. Hong Bo, she is a senior lecturer in the Financial Economics Department of Financial and Management Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. We also have Rod Wai. He's an associate fellow at Chapman House. And here in the studio with me in Moscow is Dmitry Kosorov. He is a political analyst at RIA Novosti News Agency. Okay, Hong Bo, if I can go to you first. When you hear the term, the American pivot to Asia, what does that mean to you?
I think this has been the case for the past, for quite a long time already. So when you listen to the radios, watch TVs, the news about Eastern Asian countries or China even, well, the speakers is all probably from the American politician. So I think from economic point of view, because the power is switching to the Eastern Asian and particularly which is centered in China. So I think, from political point of view, also we will see the changes of this.
Rod, what do you think about that? Because as it was just pointed out here, the Americans have been in the Pacific Rim for, always, because they are in the Pacific Rim. What is different now? What is when Obama said that? What makes it significant?
It is significant in the sense of it is a reorientation, if you like. The US now calls it rebalancing rather than a pivot. Pivot was a bit too sort of threatening in terms of the idea of huge US interests sort of coming to bear on Asia. Rebalancing is in many ways more sensible. The US, as you say, is a Pacific power. It does need to develop its relations with its Pacific neighbors. And as it draws down in Iraq, Middle East, Afghanistan, I think it is very sensible for the US to be thinking more about its immediate backyard than these more distant, far away engagements.
Okay, Dmitry, from maybe a Chinese perspective, correct me if I'm wrong, but this looks like containment. Okay, it's another, pivot, reallocation of resources, but it's almost all focused on China.
Well, yes, it is certainly looking bad for the Chinese, especially since America is playing tactics of searching for anyone who has any fears of China and getting friendly with this nation, however small it may be. But from the point of view of these small nations, one superpower substituted for another is not a good news. Before that was America as a superpower in the Pacific, the next will be China, and in what way is it better? So they want two superpowers, and they welcome America going back.
But what do you think about that? Because, I always find it really problematic. The Americans, they're using the military. There's competition, obviously, in the Pacific, but why is the military going to play such an important role? If you're talking about the sea lanes, the Chinese want the sea lanes open as much as the Americans do.
Yeah, but if you look back from the historical point of view, China has never been using, military force to invade or to attack some other territories or countries or economies. So I think the power for China, is much more on the economic side rather than on the military side.
Okay, but Rod, if the country is moving its military assets directed at you, that's threatening, isn't it?
I think Dmitry's point is a very good one. It all depends on your perspectives. The Chinese obviously tend to see everything as about themselves and as this US shift of resources as directed in part or in large part about containing China. For the US, of course, it's about strengthening its alliances with Japan, with South Korea in a region that is at the moment quite particularly troubled with the North Korean developments and, of course, the problems in the East and South China Sea.
Yeah, but that's everybody's problem, not anyone specific. Dmitry, go ahead.
Yes, there is one small point. Americans have left Asia or in a way after the defeat in the Vietnamese War. And in the meantime, China was slowly creeping out business-wise. And economy, it's a very slow process. The Americans will have spent a lot of effort and years to get back on the same level of competitiveness. While a military encroachment is easier because shifting one battalion to Australia is, it's very fast. It's maybe 1 week.
Okay. Hangbo, one of the criticisms of the American pivot, I'll keep using that term, is that some people say that it encourages some countries that have territorial issues with China to be more aggressive. How do you react to that?
I don't think the territories that was used by the American politicians will succeed if that is the aim of the Americans. But I think if you look at the Japan and China conflicts for the past few months, there will be there's no solution regarding who is going to, to be the victory side of those problems. So I think that there will be no political solution probably by the end of the day for this type of, what can we say, the play or the games. Because I do not think there will be a war for example, between Japan and China only because of this.
Rod, what do you think about that? Because they're just adding more military assets to a place where there's growing tensions. I can't see how that's a positive.
I think you need to step back and look a bit at these particular issues in a bit more of a cool light. I don't think anybody wants full-scale confrontation in the region. The problems between China and Japan are long-standing problems. They are problems about how Japan and China relate to each other in the long term, and they have a particular focus on these islands, the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea. That problem, as Hongbo has said, is not really resolvable at the moment. It is something that they are both going to have to live with. It is not susceptible to a military solution. And I think the fact of the American rebalancing the pivot is sort of made too much of, in the sense of, as you suggested, that it was sort of encouraging other countries to have a pop at China. These other countries have their particular problems with China. The South China Sea disputes are of long standing. And again, they are very complex and unlikely to be easily resolved. And I think the fact of the Americans coming back, as Dmitry said right at the beginning, is actually in many ways quite comforting to some of the smaller powers and countries in the region, because they don't want to be dominated either by China or by the United States. And China's power is undoubtedly growing.
Okay, Dmitry. I mean, is China a threat to these countries?
Well, generally no, because throughout all the history they have been on the defensive mostly. There is another kind of threat. You see, I understand why Americans did this and why they decided to pick up some nations with some grievances against China. It's very quick. But it's also very dangerous, because we have witnessed many situations when in uncertain times the smaller nations start to dictate their agenda to bigger nations, like for instance Georgia. I'm sure that nobody in the Bush administration ordered Georgia to attack South Ossetia. They did it themselves because they thought that they would push America into helping them, although it never happened, luckily. So that may happen with any small nation which whips itself up to frenzy and attacks China, hoping that America will come to their aid, whatever happens.
Okay, I want to remind our listeners that you're listening to Voice of Russia, our political debate program, debating Russia. Hangbo, is tensions going to get worse now with a greater American military presence in the Pacific? Because the tensions, the more you bring in, the more people can miscalculate, as Dmitry was saying.
But it's becoming more serious, maybe because of the North Korea at the moment, but not because of China. As I said, that when we are talking about military things or political things, we cannot forget about the economic demand. Let's say from small economies. Because everybody is now depending on the Chinese economy, which is growing, probably increasingly important in the near future. So for the North Korea, I am not sure where this thing is going. But China has an attitude that China doesn't like this situation, because China needs a relatively certain environment to keep on growing, to recover from the recession, global recession, let's say. policy.
Rod, let me give you an example. I mean, keeping the sea lanes open. Why can't China and the United States, create a partnership to do that?
I don't think either of them have a particular problem over this. I mean, you can see, for example, in the Horn of Africa, the way that the Chinese flotilla has cooperated with a wide range of international partners in protecting sea lanes against piracy in that region. They can do it. They both have, as you say, real good reasons for keeping the sea lanes open. Equally, of course, one of the things that military planners have to do is think about worst-case scenarios. And the Chinese, no doubt, think about the ways that the US might be able to contain China through domination of the sea lanes, because China is heavily dependent, as Hongbo says, on the international economy. But these are very much worst-case scenarios, and we're not talking about anything at all like that at the moment, or indeed in the foreseeable future. I think there is a real problem between China and the United States about how they develop their long-term relationship. There is a military aspect to that. There is a security aspect to that. But the principal aspects at the moment are economic and diplomatic. And these areas are also part of the US pivot towards Asia, US being more involved in a region that is crucially important to it. And indeed, as you were saying, Russia is pivoting towards Asia. Europe is pivoting towards Asia. Asia is a very important economic and diplomatic powerhouse at the moment. And we all have an interest in developing our relations with that region, including, and of course, especially China.
It's very interesting, Dimitri. I mean, maybe said in a different way, it's all how the world manages China's rise. And you could look at it that way as well.
Well, management is about balance in any case. First, it was Chinese economic power growing unhinged in Asia and anywhere in the world. Then, of course, there should be retaliation, like Americans pivot. But in the end, it'll come to balance. They will find a new, reason for being and accept it for a while.
Mm-hmm. Hongbo, what is, in your mind, what is the biggest tipping point that could create a security problem in the Pacific as the pivot goes on and as China rises?
I agree that will be tension from military point of view between China and America, but I really do not think this should be something that will become, that concerns me actually. So I think the tipping point should not come from China and maybe from some other neighboring small countries like North America, as we are seeing now. Maybe, human rights things, maybe the American will make some cases out of this type of things,
Or constantly complain about the currency value of the Chinese currency. That's always one. Rod, if I can go back to you, I mean, when you look at the American economy, I mean, the Chinese are rising here, and it's quite interesting is that the Chinese finance American debt, so America can militarize the Pacific. It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
I think that's a rather simplistic way of looking at it. I mean, the Chinese certainly wouldn't finance the US so that the US could militarize the Pacific. That is not what the Chinese are wanting.
They buy American debt.
They buy American debt so that the American economy can continue, and our own economies can continue, and global wealth can generally improve. It is not a simple one-to-one extension in any particular area. These are very big issues that have lots of ramifications, and if you look at it from one angle, you can see various things, and if you look at it from another angle, you can see different things. In the Asia Pacific, I think there is a long-standing difficulty between the Chinese and the United States as to how they should relate to each other in the long term, and both have people who argue either for containment or cooperation. And by and large, administrations in both the United States and China have opted for cooperation. Now, this is sometimes modified in various ways, but it is the most successful and likely stable long-term way of handling that relationship. Of course, their interests are going to bump up against each other in all sorts of ways, in security ways, in economic ways, in political ways. And this is what statesmen and diplomats and indeed security people are charged with managing in both China and the United States and in Russia and elsewhere. These are difficult, complex problems that should not be reduced to simple equations.
Dimitri, do you want to jump in there?
Well, I just trying to visualize situation when China quarrels again with Vietnam, for instance, like it used to be in 79 it was. There was a small war even. And we are the friends of China, obviously, when on China's side. But if China attacks Vietnam or Vietnam attacks China, then who is our friend? Whom do we give weapons? Whom do we help? So we're trying to say that, guys, don't do that, please, guys.
Use very simplistic language. As China rises, do you see it turning into a regional bully? What I'm saying is countries that get stronger are emboldened, okay? They can do good things and depending on your perspective, bad things.
Yes. I would like to go back to the first question that to Rod. So you said that China is now a creditor of the American assets. That is really true. And because China has probably the largest foreign reserve. And then that gives China a lot of power. But I would emphasize that China is not going to use this thing for the military purpose. I think what China is going to try to achieve is to let its voice to be heard by some other global players. So I think this is probably something that Chinese government is really aiming for.
Okay. Well, over the last 14 years, I think that China's military spending has increased 500% in total. So as the Americans pivot their military, I mean, this isn't you create like an arms race? I mean, where each side is eyeing each other.
This is always a problem because in any of these cases, usually each side sees itself as taking sensible and proper precautions against some perceived threat either now or in the future. And often the result is, you're right, of an increase in spending and so on and so forth. But to step back a little bit into the past for a moment, one of the big lessons I think that the Chinese learnt from the fall of the Soviet Union, which they analysed in very great detail internally, was that it was stupid and mistaken to try and compete with the US in military spending head-to-head. That was what, in the Chinese evaluation, contributed hugely to the economic collapse of the Soviet Union, and the Chinese decided they were not going to go that way. And so they have concentrated on what they call asymmetric kind of warfare, asymmetric development, so that they're not competing head-to-head with the United States to try and outspend them. They are not engaged in a direct arms race in the traditional kind of way. But at the same time, obviously, the Chinese want to protect their own security. They see increases in US power and the ability of the US to project power. And they also see important new missions for their own armed forces, as we have seen in the latest white paper of the Chinese armed forces, that they're looking for a much more diversified way of using their military power, both in a military sense and in a humanitarian sense, because this helps to project Chinese soft power. And as China becomes a stronger nation in all sorts of ways, it feels it quite proper that its military and security capabilities should increase in a corresponding fashion.
Certainly, because of course Russia are also watching Chinese, shall we say, successes, especially in maritime development, and we know quite well that nobody has the money now. Even China doesn't have the money to achieve balance and parity with America on the high seas. It will take them maybe 50 years and huge resources to build the same amount of aircraft carriers. So what they can hope for currently is some kind of presence in Pacific and Indian Oceans. That's all.
I'd like to point out also is that China doesn't have any foreign bases in the world. None.
They may have. They may
maybe in the future,
to get something
but today they don't.
In the Indian Oceans. Today they don't.
Hongbang, what about that? Do you see that happening where, because the Americans have bases all over the world. I mean, over 900 or something like that.
A lot can help them.
Hongbang, what do you think about it? Do you see that happening? I mean, it doesn't have to be threatening either. I mean, it can be very positive.
No. Yeah, as I said that, China is Chinese strategy is to try to, let's say, using the invade the other part of the world, probably by their economic power rather than military. But I do not see, to be honest, I do not see the possibility that where are they going to base the Chinese military bases? Maybe because the lack of knowledge from this side, from me. So I do not see this is going to happen very soon.
Ron, what do you think about it? It was interesting you gave the example of the Soviet Union. I wonder if the Chinese are watching the Americans, go bankrupt. They don't have to outspend the Americans.
I think think that is probably true, that they have decided that this is not a sensible way for them to proceed. At the same time, very obviously, they are increasing their military expenditures and capabilities, and their interests around the world are increasing hugely. I mean, you go anywhere in the world these days and there is a Chinese presence, and very often a significant Chinese presence. And this will be, in the longer term, providing real reasons for Chinese to be worried about the security of their individuals. One of the things that they pointed to is the very successful evacuation of 36,000 Chinese nationals from Libya when things went terribly wrong in Libya. China needs capabilities to protect its nationals, to bring them out of difficult situations, and to protect them from difficult situations that they might find themselves in around the world. This is a position that China has not been in before, and it needs and is developing new capabilities to be able to meet those challenges. I think you can never say never about what anyone will do, but for the moment, yes, there is no obvious sign that the Chinese are seeking to develop a network of regional military bases around the world. At the same time, they are developing networks of military cooperation with many, many countries, because they will find it necessary, as they did with the Libyan evacuation, to work in tandem with other countries to bring their nationals out of difficult situations, for just one example.
And maybe another example is because of China's involvement in developing Africa's economy with more and more people there. Dimitri, speak a little bit about Russia's pivot to Asia. In many ways, it's quite problematic because Russia's trade ties go the other direction. Okay, almost all of the energy, for example, okay, there are some pipelines there, but it's going to take a lot of money for Russia to reorient itself if it does want to look east more.
This is going to be the Chinese money. Speaking about oil fields, we are developing them in the east of Russia. They were untapped so far, and we are taking Chinese credit for that. So that's understandable and easy. Second, if you are speaking about Russia's pivot to Asia, it's not only business. There are many more things, more basic. They go deeper. It's our new understanding of what the devil we are. What kind of nation are we? Are we Asian, or are we European, or something in the middle? To put it short, we discover that we basically have always been an Asian nation, which was by necessity maybe in around 17th century. Our elites has tried to make us European, and in my opinion, failed ignominiously.
This is the Voice of Russia, broadcasting from the heart of London. From Monday to Friday, we're live here on digital from 4 p.m. until 8. We're also online at ruvr.co.uk. Tune in for current affairs, news, arts and debate.
Okay, I want to remind our listeners that you're listening to Voice of Russia, our political debate program, debating Russia. But what do you think about, with this pivot, everyone's pivoting to Asia, and it's all because of China, or almost exclusively about China?
Yeah, I think actually regarding the economic cooperation between Russia and China, there are quite a lot of things to do. Yes, you cannot change the existing pipes. For the oil and the gas thing, but you can do something else. For example, the financial system is underdeveloped in the Russian economy and the service sector, and those. By the way, if you build up new pipes, you can just pivot towards China rather than to the North American or European countries. So there are economic cooperation. I think Russia has a lot of things, had a lot of opportunities if Russia builds up a very good relationship with China.
Ron, what do you, I don't know if you know a lot about the Russian economy in Asia, but one of the interesting things is that the Russians and the Chinese argued for a long time over a pipeline because the Russians just don't want to have one buyer, okay? Because when you have one buyer, you don't have a lot of control. This is the kind of the costs when countries look at when you reorient to a different region.
Energy is always highly political. It's not just a straight commercial deal. And if it were a straight commercial deal, I think there would be a lot less of a problem between China and Russia over coming to a satisfactory arrangement for both sides. It has taken an awful long time to get where we are. I think both the Chinese and the Russians are harbour suspicions about each other and particularly about not wanting to get under the control of the other side. It is important for China as a buyer, and it's important for Russia as a seller. And I think these political inhibitions, despite the very good bilateral political relationship, nonetheless, these fundamental concerns that both sides have about maintaining their own independence of action will continue to at least inhibit the development of the energy relationship between the two. And of course, the whole of the world energy markets are entering a period of rapid transformation if the shale oil revolution actually takes place.
I would probably say not about energy relations, which is very simple and understandable, but I heard it mentioning about some suspicions toward each other. Frankly speaking, I don't see much of that. There's suspicions and outright hatred and distrust between Russia and Europe that has lasted for so many centuries. It's probably incurable. But with China, no. There is no such thing. The only problem is that when we talk about energy and deal with Chinese, they love poetry maybe, but the moment they start counting money, they're not poetic at all. They're terrible, and they can haggle to the last cent. So, of course, we are trying to get many buyers, which is hard to come by.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes.
You want to reply to
that? I really agree. Actually, I agree with the last speaker about, when it comes to the business and who cares, And I think I see that, they both Russia and China, they depend on with each other, depends on each other very much so. So in terms of the domestic market, in terms of also the energy things, and China will be a big market for Russia in this industry only. But as I said, that there are many other things to do: consumer goods sector, service sector, financial sector, And China is, I would say, is a little bit more advanced than the development of the Russian economy at the moment, as far as I can see. And from that perspective, I think Russia has a lot of opportunity.
Well, it's really interesting. Do you see that the American pivot in the Pacific would push Russia and China closer together?
In a sense, yes, and in a sense, no. I mean, I think Dmitry is absolutely right. China and Russia have at the moment, fundamental security problems. There is a time within at least my living memory when they did. So it is not impossible for this to happen again. I think China is very much more powerful in terms of its economic power and influence in the Russian Far East, for example, than necessarily Moscow would be completely comfortable with, and is not in a hurry to help China develop even more power and influence in that kind of way. But I think if you're looking purely at the security angle, that Russia is not, and I think probably deliberately not, a big player in the Pacific at the moment. And competition between China and the United States, however that is expressed in that region, is something that the Russians, by and large, are quite happy not to be a direct part of. China and Russia, equally in terms of many of the big issues of global governance, find a lot of common interest in opposing what they see as the overbearing power of the U.S.
Okay, we've run out of time. Hung Bo, Rod, and here Dmitry in the studio with me here in Moscow. Thank you very much for participating in Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. Stay with us.